Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's version of your life? My name is Rebecca, and for 15 years, I thought I was living the perfect Christian marriage. Today, I'll tell you how one conversation at church shattered that illusion. Pastor Michael Thompson was everything our congregation admired in a spiritual leader. When we married, fresh out of seminary, I believed I was stepping into a blessed union. I was young, idealistic, and completely unprepared for what being a pastor's wife would actually mean. From the beginning, our life was lived under a microscope. Every outfit I wore to church was scrutinized by the congregation. Every word I spoke was analyzed for its spiritual appropriateness. Every smile had to be genuine but not too bright. Every tear shed had to be for the right reasons. And every decision had to reflect perfectly on Michael's ministry. Rebecca, you understand that we're not just husband and wife. We're partners in God's work. Everything we do reflects on the church, on our calling, on the gospel itself. I embraced this responsibility wholeheartedly, organizing the women's ministry, teaching Sunday school, coordinating church potlucks, and ensuring our home was always open to congregation members who needed counsel or simply wanted to visit. I thought I was living purposefully, serving God through service to others. But somewhere along the way, partnership felt increasingly one-sided. Michael's schedule became more demanding, his attention more divided, his presence at home more sporadic. When I mentioned feeling lonely or overwhelmed, he would remind me that ministry required sacrifice, that God was calling us to put his work before our own comfort. "The congregation needs us, Rebecca," he would say when I asked for more time together. "These people are depending on us to be their spiritual anchors. We can't let them down because we're feeling selfish." The first crack appeared 3 years ago, when Michael became more secretive and distant. He would receive phone calls that he would take in private, stepping out of rooms when I entered. His computer, once freely accessible to me for church administrative tasks, suddenly required passwords that he claimed were for security purposes. When I tried to address these concerns, he would deflect by praising my dedication to the church and the congregation. "You have such a gift for listening without judging," he would say, his tone suggesting this was both a compliment and a subtle reminder of what he expected from me. That phrase became something he repeated often, especially when deflecting difficult conversations about our relationship. I began to understand that my greatest strength in his eyes, my ability to offer grace and forgiveness, to listen without criticism, was also my greatest limitation. I was the safe harbor where he could dock his guilt without fear of storms or judgment. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had become the person everyone turned to for relationship advice, while my own marriage was slowly dissolving. Women in our congregation would spend hours sharing their marital struggles with me, seeking biblical guidance and prayer support, while I sat listening to their stories of unfaithful husbands and emotional neglect, never recognizing the parallels to my own situation. Michael's pastoral counseling sessions with Sarah Martinez, our newly divorced choir director, became increasingly frequent and private. What started as weekly scheduled appointments during regular office hours gradually evolved into evening meetings, weekend phone calls, and impromptu visits to our home when I wasn't present. When I questioned the frequency of these sessions, Michael would respond with spiritual authority mixed with gentle condescension. "Sarah has been through tremendous trauma with her divorce," he would explain patiently. "The church hurt her deeply when some members took her ex-husband's side. She needs intensive pastoral care to rebuild her faith and her ability to trust again." The explanation was reasonable, biblically sound, and emotionally compelling. Sarah had indeed been hurt by members of our congregation who had sided with her ex-husband, a prominent businessman in our community. She had every right to need extensive spiritual guidance as she rebuilt her life. My concerns seemed petty and uncharitable in comparison, and Michael's patient explanations made me feel selfish for wanting more of his time and attention. The signs kept accumulating. Michael worked later hours, often not answering his office phone. His explanations always involved church business or emergency pastoral needs. Meanwhile, his praise for Sarah's character became more effusive. He would highlight her musical contributions and use her as an example in sermons about forgiveness and healing. Sarah is such an example of grace under pressure, he told me one Sunday. She maintains such a positive attitude and never speaks ill of anyone. The contrast between his admiration for Sarah and criticism of other congregation members became pronounced. The most troubling change was in our physical relationship. Michael became distant and distracted. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March when I arrived home from leading the women's Bible study. I'd stayed late to counsel Jennifer Walsh, who was struggling with her own marriage difficulties, and I was emotionally drained from listening to her fears about her husband's growing distance and suspected infidelity. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed both Michael's car and another vehicle I didn't immediately recognize. The house appeared dark from the outside, but as I approached the front door, I could hear muffled voices coming from Michael's study, voices that seemed unusually urgent and intimate in a way that made my stomach clench with a mixture of anxiety and growing certainty. When the study door finally opened, Sarah emerged looking flushed and emotional, her hair slightly disheveled and her eyes bright with unshed tears. She barely acknowledged me as she hurried past, muttering something about needing to get home to her children. Sarah needed emergency counseling. She had a panic attack. That night, lying next to my husband, who seemed like a stranger, I finally admitted what I'd been refusing to see. My marriage was built on lies. The weeks following were torture. I began cataloging inconsistencies, phone calls Michael would step outside to take, meetings that ran long, changes in his appearance. Church members made casual comments that painted a disturbing picture. Pastor Mike sure has been spending a lot of time helping Sarah get back on her feet, mentioned Dorothy Peterson after Sunday service. It's wonderful to see how dedicated he is to helping her through this difficult time. I saw Sarah's car at the church pretty late last Tuesday, offered Tom Martinez during a men's ministry meeting. Must have been some serious counseling session to go that long. Sarah seems so much happier lately, observed Linda Chen during our women's Bible study. Whatever pastoral guidance she's been receiving is really helping her heal. She practically glows now. Each comment was innocent enough on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made my heart race with anxiety and dread. The congregation was noticing what I had been trying not to see, and their observations were being delivered as compliments about Michael's ministerial dedication. I started driving by the church at odd hours, telling myself I was just running errands or checking on something I had forgotten. Too often, I would see two cars in the parking lot. Michael's familiar blue sedan, and Sarah's silver SUV, parked close together in the otherwise empty lot. When I would mention these sightings casually during dinner conversations, Michael always had explanations ready, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had anticipated the questions. Sarah's been having trouble with her faith after everything she's been through, he would explain, not looking up from his plate. Sometimes she needs to talk things through late at night when the day's events have triggered difficult memories. I can't turn away someone who's seeking spiritual guidance just because it's inconvenient timing. The explanations were always couched in spiritual language that made me feel guilty for questioning them. How could I doubt a man who was sacrificing his own comfort to help a hurting soul? How could I be suspicious of behavior that was so clearly motivated by Christian love and pastoral duty? But my body knew what my mind was trying to deny. I started having trouble sleeping, losing my appetite, and feeling constantly on edge. During church services, I would find myself watching Michael and Sarah for signs of improper connection, analyzing their interactions for evidence of intimacy that went beyond pastoral care. During our monthly board meeting, Michael spoke enthusiastically about expanding the counseling ministry. When people feel truly heard, the healing that can occur is remarkable. Board members praised his dedication, mentioning Sarah specifically as a success story. Listening to Michael receive praise for transforming Sarah while our marriage crumbled privately became unbearable. After the meeting, as we drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, the silence between us felt heavy with unspoken tensions and growing suspicions. I watched the familiar landmarks pass by, the coffee shop where we used to have date nights, the park where we had walked and planned our future together, the homes of congregation members who looked up to us as spiritual leaders. Finally, I found the courage to break the silence and confront the situation that had been consuming my thoughts for weeks. "Michael," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the hum of the car engine, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He glanced at me warily, his hands tightening almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. In the dim light from the dashboard, I could see tension in his jaw and a guarded expression that I had never seen directed at me before. "Of course, Rebecca," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "What's on your mind?" The question I had been rehearsing in my head for days suddenly felt enormous and terrifying. Once I spoke it aloud, there would be no taking it back, no pretending I hadn't noticed what I had noticed, no returning to the comfortable fiction that our marriage was what it appeared to be. "Are you having an affair with Sarah Martinez?" His response was immediate and devastating. "I'm disappointed you would ask such a question. Sarah is going through trauma. The fact that you would interpret Christian ministry as inappropriate shows how much the enemy is working against us." When I asked to see his phone, he refused, citing pastoral confidentiality. In that refusal, I heard the confirmation I'd been dreading. What pushed me to public action was overhearing a conversation between Sarah and another struggling wife during coffee hour after Sunday service. I had stepped into the church kitchen to help clean up the coffee urns and put away leftover pastries when I heard Sarah's voice drifting from the fellowship hall. She was speaking to Jennifer Walsh, one of the younger women in our congregation who had been married for only 3 years and was already experiencing serious problems with her husband's drinking and emotional distance. "I know it's hard to understand right now," Sarah was saying, in that gentle, wise tone she had perfected over recent months. "But sometimes God allows marriages to end because He has something better planned for both people. Sometimes what looks like failure is actually freedom, and what feels like an ending is really a new beginning." "But the Bible says marriage is supposed to be permanent," Jennifer replied, her voice filled with confusion and spiritual conflict. "How do I know when I'm supposed to fight for my marriage and when I'm supposed to accept that it's over? How do I know what God actually wants me to do?" "That's exactly the kind of spiritual question you should be discussing with Pastor Mike," Sarah responded smoothly. "He has such wisdom about these difficult situations. He's been helping me understand that sometimes holding on to something that's already dead prevents God from bringing new life into our circumstances." The irony was staggering. Sarah offering marriage advice while destroying mine, potentially recruiting other vulnerable women. I spent a week gathering evidence and consulting Dr. Patricia Williamson, a Christian counselor experienced with pastoral misconduct. She helped me understand this wasn't just about a cheating husband, but about a pastor violating sacred trust. I chose to reveal the truth during Sunday service when Michael opened the floor for sharing. I had never spoken publicly during this time, but I knew if I was going to expose the truth, it needed to be where the entire congregation could hear. "Good morning," I began, standing in my usual front row seat. "For months, I have watched my husband provide intensive pastoral counseling to Sarah Martinez. Last week, Michael told me Sarah is wonderful because she listens without judging." The congregation fell silent, sensing something significant was happening. "So, I want to offer Sarah an opportunity to demonstrate that non-judgmental listening my husband values so much." I looked directly at Sarah, then at Michael. "If she listens without judging, then let her pay for your sins." After the absolute silence that followed, I continued. "The congregation deserves to know that their pastor has been having an affair with Sarah Martinez under the guise of pastoral counseling." The explosion of voices was immediate and chaotic. As I walked out that morning, my 15-year tenure as the ideal pastor's wife officially over, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the relief of finally telling the truth. The investigation that followed uncovered a pattern far worse than I'd imagined. The denominational committee found that Michael had engaged in spiritual abuse with at least 4 other women over 5 years, systematically using his pastoral authority to create inappropriate relationships. Sarah wasn't his first victim. Dr. Morrison, the denominational representative, explained, "and wouldn't have been his last. Your decision probably prevented other women from being hurt." The responses fell into several distinct categories, each revealing about the true nature of our church community. Some longtime members expressed complete shock and disbelief. These were people who had known us since the beginning of our ministry, who had held us up as examples of Christian marriage. "Rebecca, I just can't believe this is true," said Martha Stevens, who had been in our congregation for over 20 years. "Pastor Mike has always seemed so devoted to you, so committed to his ministry. Are you absolutely sure you're not misunderstanding the situation?" These conversations forced me to relive and justify my decision to speak publicly rather than handle the situation privately. A second group consisted of people who claimed they had suspected something, but hadn't known how to address it. "I noticed how much time Pastor Mike was spending with Sarah," admitted Carol Johnson, "but I never wanted to think badly of our pastor, and I certainly didn't want to gossip about something that might be innocent." Most troubling were those who expressed anger not at Michael's betrayal, but at my decision to make it public, feeling I had damaged the church's reputation. Several of Michael's victims chose to share their stories, helping break the shame and secrecy. Michael alternated between reconciliation attempts and angry accusations about destroying his ministry. Sarah disappeared, resigning and moving back to her hometown. The church board placed Michael on administrative leave and brought in an interim pastor. For me, the aftermath brought relief, but new challenges. After 15 years as a pastor's wife, I had to rebuild my life from scratch at 38, learning to trust my own judgment again after years of deferring to Michael's authority. Through counseling, I understood how Michael had weaponized my Christian values, my commitment to forgiveness, my desire to be supportive, to keep me silent while he pursued other relationships. 6 months later, I received a letter from Sarah acknowledging her role and describing her own experience of manipulation. While I wasn't ready to forgive, I was grateful for her honesty and recognized that she too had been victimized, even as she participated in victimizing me. My role in the church evolved significantly. I began facilitating support groups for women who had experienced spiritual abuse and worked with the board to develop educational programs about preventing ministerial misconduct. "You have a unique perspective," Reverend Chen told me. "Your experience gives you credibility and wisdom that can help others." This new role was both challenging and fulfilling, allowing me to use my painful experience to help others while giving me purpose as I rebuilt my life. 1 year later, I stood before a women's conference focused on spiritual abuse and recovery, sharing the message that had changed my life, the importance of speaking truth, even when painful. I learned that there's a difference between godly submission and enabling sin, I told the audience. There's a difference between biblical forgiveness and allowing abuse to continue. My personal healing had progressed significantly. I had moved into my own apartment, started working as a victim advocate, and built new friendships based on honesty rather than image management. The work was meaningful. Many women I counseled dealt with situations similar to mine: spiritual leaders who had abused authority, congregations that prioritized reputation over justice. Michael had moved to another state, working in sales with no attempts at restoration. My former church had continued healing under new leadership, implementing policies that were being adopted by other churches. What you did was necessary, Margaret Phillips had told me. Our church is stronger because we've learned to value truth over comfort. The personal cost had been significant. My marriage was over, my previous life dismantled, but the benefits far outweighed those costs. I had rediscovered my identity and strength, evolved from someone who defined herself through her husband's ministry into someone who understood her own worth. I used to think being a good Christian meant never causing conflict, but sometimes love requires difficult truths. Sometimes protecting the innocent means challenging the powerful. The response was overwhelming. Women shared their own stories, many recognizing patterns they'd never had language to describe. As I drove home, I reflected on my transformation. The phrase, "then let her pay for your sins," had been born from anger, but also from understanding that accountability is necessary for healing. By breaking my silence, demanding accountability, and refusing to carry someone else's burden, I had freed myself and helped create space for truth in our community. The cost had been high, but the alternative, continued silence and ongoing abuse, would have been much higher. Today, I sleep peacefully, knowing I chose truth over comfort, and that choice was the most loving thing I could do for everyone involved. If this story shocked you, just wait for what's next. Leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and of course, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a single notification.